Hello and welcome to this Affinity photo tutorial, which is a beginner's guide part 11. Now I want to look at changing and altering and making keyboard shortcuts and maybe touching on a couple of other little items in the preferences. Now keyboard shortcuts, it's just a case of pressing combinations of keys to get certain functions to happen. So on your keyboard, if you want the brush, for example, you need to press the B key on your keyboard. Now there are many sort of tutorials where they will just say press such and such to have something happen, but pretty much all of those keyboard shortcuts do have their alternatives in the menus. So one good example is to invert a layer, which is Control plus I on a PC and I believe Command plus I on a Mac, but in the layer menu you have invert, and as you can see over here it lists that Control plus I is the keyboard shortcut. So in all of these menus you have the options down the left, but on the right you have the keyboard shortcuts and their combinations. Now I'm working on a PC, so so like open a new file is Control plus N. So on a Mac it would be Command plus N. So new from clipboard for me would be Control, Alt, Shift and N, so you've got to hold down 4 keys at the same time. So on a Mac it would be Command, and I believe that's Option, Shift and N. Now some of these options are greyed out. Say for example print. You can't use the print command because I have nothing open and there is nothing to print, so it's greyed out, so you can't use it. But the keyboard shortcut for this is Control plus P. Now let me just open a picture so some options will work. So we'll open this one. Now one of the main sort of things that I've made keyboard shortcuts for is changing these color options up here back to black and white. Because if, say for example, one was set on blue and the other one was set on a weird pink colour, and I want to get back to black and white, rather than have to go through the process of changing everything, I made a keyboard shortcut of Alt and X. Now you may wonder why you'd want a shortcut for that. Well, if you are using lots of adjustment layers, or you want to add layer masks and you want to paint on those layer masks, the colours you use would be black and white. So getting back to black and white is sort of quite a handy thing to do. So I'm now going to press Alt and X on my keyboard and they will change back to black and white very quickly. So I will sort of look at changing that and a few other options. Now to get to changing these shortcuts you need to come up to the edit menu and down to preferences, and there is a keyboard shortcut for this, and this is Control and the comma key. And then one of the options here is keyboard shortcuts, and this will open up this panel here. Now this top button here is set on photo, but you do have all of the personas and a couple of other options like panorama and astrophotography stacking. So you could, for example, like the keyboard shortcut to duplicate a selection is Control plus J, but you could set it up for it to be Control plus J in the photo persona and Control plus something else in the liquify persona and Control plus something completely different in the develop persona. Quite why you would alter it I don't know, but there is that possibility. So if you want to make a keyboard shortcut in a specific persona, you need to select that persona. Now the option underneath that starts off on the file, and these are these menus up here. So we've got the file menu there, so all these options here should be what is available in the file menu up here. So as you can see, we've got here export LUT, and that's export LUT there, and I would somewhere down here there should be print. There you go. Print is Control plus P, and save is Control plus S. And like all of these menus, I mean, a lot of these are like the default settings for keyboard shortcuts, but if you don't like them, you know, like if you don't want to hold down 4 keys to do something, you can pick a different option. And the ones that don't have any options, you can then make an option for them by finding the option that you want and then make a keyboard shortcut. So that is looking at the file menu. So then, like I said, you got that, then they should correspond with all those that are up there. So you've got edit, text, document, all the way down to help. So you get all the different options in there. So if we come to like the layer menu, we will then get things like invert and other options that we got here. It should be in here, and these are done alphabetically. So invert is probably, well, maybe, yeah, they should be alphabetical, I think. Oh, there we go. Invert, Control plus I. Now I'm just going to shut this quickly for a second. Now this sort of came about because someone was having trouble following a tutorial where someone had added a HSL adjustment in this tutorial, and then in the tutorial they said to invert the layer, or it would technically be inverting the mask, and they said use Control plus I. And the person following the tutorial kept pressing Control plus I, and it didn't work. So I did suggest to them, if they come up to the layer menu, they could just click on invert, but also to check what it said over here, to check that Control plus I was the keyboard shortcut that was set up. I mean, it may have been changed somehow, or it may be blank. So that's what I suggested that they do. But also I did suggest that they come to the layer menu and find invert, and even if it said Control plus I told them to sort of get rid of it, which would be like click on the cross there. So if I come up to the layer menu, invert no longer says Control plus I up here, and then I can put Control plus I back in by pressing the Control key and then the I key, and then when I come up to the layer menu, invert has now got Control plus I back as its setting. Because I had this happen to me once in a very early version of Affinity Photo, not specifically with the invert option. I don't know, can't quite remember what the option was, but it was saying up in the menu that it was a certain option, and then when I came into preferences, it still had that was a particular option, say for example Control plus I. So what I did was I changed it to something else completely, closed it, came back, and then I came back to the preferences and I put the, in this example, Control plus I back in, and then it accepted that option, and I've never had a problem with it since. So if you are having a problem with the keyboard shortcuts, I think it's a good idea to find where the option is and then sort of change it and put it back to what it should be, and hopefully that will sort the problem for you. So that is looking at that. A bit further down here we have the tools. Now the tools are pretty much all of these options down here on the left. So like you've got all the different brush tools and what have you. So the paint mixer brush, the only options you've got here is for increase the brush size and decrease the brush size by using the square bracket keys. Pretty much all of the brush tools will have that option. And let's try the pen tool. Pen tool, you can, they have got none set for it at the moment, but you can make them if you want. And then other tools that you can make shortcuts for certain things. And the last one is miscellaneous. Now this is where we will find the option for changing the colours here, and that is set fill to black and white. And like I said, I've got mine set up to be Alt and X, and I've also got it set up to make one of the colours 50% grey, because sometimes you can need 50% grey in certain editing options. So I've made mine Alt plus 5 for 50, but you don't have to sort of stay with that. And we've also got here, like down here in the bottom, you've got zoom in and zoom out. Now you can zoom in and zoom out using the navigator option down here, or I've got my mouse set up to zoom in and out with the wheel in the center of the mouse. But you could set up a keyboard shortcut. Now the obvious option, for example, might be to use the Z key. Now you have to be careful when changing keyboard shortcuts, because some of these options may already be used. I mean, Control plus Z is the option to undo certain things that you've already done, say Control plus Z. So you might have wanted to use like Control plus Z to zoom in and Control plus X to zoom out, but the X is also used for the cut command. So you need to sort of be very wary of what keys you use. But we could, for example, maybe use the Shift key. So if I click in this box here and do Shift plus Z to zoom in and Shift plus X to zoom out, and it's put a little yellow mark there. So Shift plus X is already being used by something else. So let's try something else. So let's try Shift plus C. Now it's happy with that, so I will close this, and then I will use the Shift plus Z to zoom in and Shift plus C to zoom out. And I will just undo that, because I don't really want the zoom option to be keyboard shortcuts. So let me just get rid of that one, and close that down. So I no longer have a keyboard shortcut to zoom in and out. Now before I move on to looking at some other preference items, I just want to mention, like previously I said about being careful about picking which keys you use for keyboard shortcuts, because you will sort of might be using something that's already in use. Now in some cases that is okay to do, so because by default some of these tools down the side here do have the same keyboard shortcut for the different options, and a pretty good sort of one to look at here is the Paintbrush Tool, because as you can see, if I put the cursor over that icon, it comes up with the Paintbrush Tool and in brackets B, telling you that that is the keyboard shortcut. But in this menu you do also have the Color Replacement Brush Tool and the Pixel Brush Tool. So if I sort of click on that and we have the Paintbrush Tool, if I press the B key again, it will cycle through those 3 different brush types. So you've got to be careful that if you press the B key, you don't accidentally press it twice, sort of, or by accident or what have you, and get the wrong brush that you were looking for. So let me put this back on to the Paintbrush Tool, and any of these that have like the little black arrow underneath the icon, like this one here, the Healing Brush Tool, and the keyboard shortcut is J. Well, in here we have the Painting Brush Tool, so we've got like 5 items. So if I press J, it will cycle through those items. Let me put it back on the Painting Brush Tool. So you have these different options. So, but if you add some other icons down here, I'm pretty certain they won't show up in the Tools option in the Preferences in the keyboard shortcuts. You would have to find a keyboard shortcut and make them all the same. So for example, like the filters. Now in the filters, like the blurs, we've got all these blur filters, but none of them have a keyboard shortcut. So if I go to the keyboard shortcuts and we come to filters, you can see we have all of these different blur filters and other filters, none of which have a keyboard shortcut until we get down here to Lens Distortion, which is Control, Shift and R. I think there's another one near the bottom. There we go. Repeat last filter, Control, Alt and F. Then let's say for example you want, probably the most used one is Gaussian Blur, that one there. So I know the R key is available, so you can press R to have Gaussian Blur come up, and let's say another one, we'll make Motion Blur R as well, and you get this message here that tells you, like this little yellow symbol. If you put the cursor over it, it will tell you what else is also using that key. But for the sake of this example, I'm going to keep that, and if I press the R key, the Gaussian Blur filter will turn up. But if you press the R key again, it will just put the R in here. It will not cycle through to the Motion Blur filter. So in that case you can't join them by having the same letter like you can with some of these icons here, because you can't cycle through. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me just undo that so I'm not stuck with this. Filters. I mean, I might keep having the Gaussian Blur because you have that quite a lot in tutorials, but I'll get rid of the Motion Blur, and then when I come to the filters menu, blur, it has the R is the keyboard shortcut for Gaussian Blur. Now, as clever and as good as the keyboard shortcuts are, there's an awful lot of things to remember. I mean, even with just the basic default ones there are loads, just like on the select menu. You've got Control plus A for select all, Control plus D for deselect. But are you really going to remember all these different combinations of like Shift plus F6 for feather and Control Alt plus R for refine edges? And that's just one menu. I mean, if you look at the layer menu, you're not going to remember all of these things. So if you are going to make new keyboard shortcuts, first off I would say just make ones that you personally use a lot, because like I've made for changing the colours, so Alt plus X, it just speeds up my personal working, and I find it easy to remember. But if you do make your own, make it something that you can easily remember. For example, not that I could use the Z as such, but for zoom in, the Z is quite an obvious letter to pick because Z for zoom. So that is something to bear in mind. And lastly, I just want to add, when it comes to keyboard shortcuts, over here on the right we have two buttons, load and save. Now if you do make your own keyboard shortcuts, or you alter something that's already got a shortcut but you want something a bit easier and more memorable to you, you can then save those as a file somewhere on your computer, and if at some later date you have to reinstall Affinity Photo for some reason, you can load in that saved file without having to re-enter all your favourite shortcuts that you've made, and it will save you a lot of time. So that's something hopefully you may never need to do, but it is a safety net if you have made your own keyboard shortcuts. So it's worth sort of saving them once you've made all the ones you want to make, and keep it somewhere safe on a different drive somewhere, or a different file or folder, and it may save you a lot of time in the future if something happens. Now that's a sort of quick look at using keyboard shortcuts and setting up a keyboard shortcuts. Now there are a couple of options that I also want to sort of just touch on. I mean, I have mentioned in a previous one about previous beginner's guide about changing the interface. You can have the dark interface or the light interface, and you have other settings here. Now pretty much all the settings in the preferences, apart from the keyboard shortcuts, I've not really tampered with, but there are a couple of exceptions, and one of those being, I believe it's in general, is putting a tick into these two boxes here about import PSD text as text and import PSD smart objects where possible. Now if you're going to be using Photoshop files, you really do have to have those two ticked to be able to use them as best as Affinity Photo can use them. So those two options, and that's in the General tab, and the other one I believe is in, is it Tools? Oh yeah. Like I said before, I use my mouse wheel to zoom in and out, so I put a tick in this, and so I can now use my mouse wheel to zoom in and out without having to make a keyboard shortcut or use the zoom option down here, or if it's available as an option in one of these menus, I don't have to bother with that, I can just use my mouse. So they're the sort of 2 or 3 different options that I've changed in preferences You can tinker with lots of other settings, but by and large I would advise to leave them alone unless you know what you're doing. But for me, changing or turning on the mouse wheel to zoom and changing the option to be able to use Photoshop files are sort of very key things to turn on. So basically I think that is this very quick look at making and using keyboard shortcuts. So thank you for watching and goodbye.